Hey, you're back. I'm back. You're back. We're all back. Hey, this is Tim Laskus, and you're listening to The Tim Laskus Show. This is episode 95 with David Barnett. Now, David gives the inside scoop to buying and selling businesses. He is the guru. He's the guy to go to in order to sell your business. He has years of experience, and he's an author of 7 books, 3 of which were bestsellers, and he has online courses and tips and videos on his website. So if you head on over to davidcbarnett.com and you could check all this out. But before that, listen to this episode because I know you're going to enjoy it.
The Tim Laskus Show, in search of entrepreneurial gold. Tim digs deep into the minds of his guests, entertaining, down to earth, and informative. Now, here's your host, Tim Laskus.
Hey, David, welcome. Thanks for being on the show.
Hey, Tim, thanks for inviting me.
Hey, it's a pleasure. So tell the listeners a little bit about yourself aside from business. What do you do for fun up in New Brunswick?
Well, being on the east coast of Canada, we've got lots of nature. And so I take full advantage of that. I love the outdoors. I like hiking. I like riding my bike through the woods, doing a little bit of mountain biking. And I even extend that into one of my passions, which is scouting. My children are involved in scouting, and so of course I'm a scout leader.
So you ever take them out in the middle of the woods in the wintertime when it's freezing out and just leave them and say, I'll see you tomorrow?
No, we're not allowed to do that at their ages. They're only 7 and 9. We have to wait a few more years before we're allowed to do that.
Maybe another year or two, and they'll be ready for that.
But
hey,
I love being outside. In fact, just 2 weekends ago, me and a couple of my adult friends, we went actually to Maine, and we climbed Mount Katahdin up in Baxter State Park, which is the northern terminus of the Appalachian Trail. And it was kind of cool because we saw a lot of people who had been hiking for months, having their finishing day, and they were, lots of really excited people on the trail.
Well, I'm sure there's a lot of stinky people on the trail too, without months without a bath. So you could probably smell them before you could hear them coming. But
yeah, I think that helps keep the bears away.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, David, tell the listeners a little bit about yourself professionally. What are you currently working on?
Well, I help people buy and sell businesses. That's what I do. And so I work with clients one-on-one and help them through the process of either doing an acquisition or selling a business. And then to support that, I have got all kinds of educational products. So I've got 7 different books out. 3 of them were bestsellers on Amazon. I've got 5 different online courses. And right now what I'm working on is putting together the team for my 2018 Buy a Successful Business Accelerator program, where I actually work with a small group, only 8 participants, and we meet regularly. And the goal is that each of them buys a business in 2018. That's what I'm working on right now.
That's excellent. Now, I have a question from, some of the listeners out there may be small business owners, you kind of new entrepreneurs, and they may be thinking down the road, hey, I might like to sell this company one day. What should they be doing in the beginning that may help them later down the road if they do decide to sell? Yeah,
well, it's interesting. I've got a short ebook which is free that people can download, and it's called 12 Things to Do Before You Consider Selling Your Business. So people should read that. It's not a long read, but I always tell people that thinking about selling your business sometime down the road, you're already too late. You need to have a plan of what you're going to likely do from the beginning, because that plan of what you're likely going to do is going to inform your decisions along the way. So whether you decide to purchase a piece of equipment outright or lease one, knowing what you're going to do with your business is actually going to be an important part of understanding whether you should own or lease equipment. For example, one of the things I point out to people is that the most difficult thing for a buyer when they buy a business is to obtain financing. So if you lease all of your equipment when you're operating your business, a buyer can simply come along and assume those leases, and it's like you've built financing into your business. So that's just one tiny little peek at some of the things that you start to think about when you actually know that you're going to be selling your business one day. And probably the biggest one is to have good, clean books and not be doing the things that small business people are tempted to do all the times in order to minimize taxes. Because there's nothing that is going to be more difficult to deal with than a set of books that don't accurately reflect what's going on in your business. And that's the other big thing that I deal with people on a regular basis with, is having to demonstrate to buyers that a business is really better than what it looks like on paper because the owner was doing things to try to minimize their tax burden.
Got you. Let's back up a little bit to the leases. Now, when you're talking about leasing equipment, let's say that I'm the business owner and I lease equipment from whomever, makes that equipment. And then when I sell my company, so am I just having them deal with the old, person who I was leasing it from, or do I just kind of set up a system where I then lease it to the new buyer and I keep paying my original leaseor?
Let me give you an example. Let's say you have a business and there's some equipment and you lease some equipment and then you decide to sell the business. If there are, $50,000 of outstanding payments on that lease, if you sold the business as an asset sale with everything having clear title, you would take money from the buyer and you would pay the leasing company, right? You would have to clear the debt on that equipment. But what is a nice feature of many leases is the buyer can simply make an application to the leasing company and say, look, I'd like to become the person on this lease. And the leasing company can release you if it's an assumable lease and make the new person liable for those payments. It's exactly the same as you receiving the money and handing it over to the leasing company, right? Because now you don't have to pay that debt. So if there was $50,000 owed in outstanding payments, it's like they put $50,000 on the table. And so what you're doing is you're building in financing capacity into your own business so that it's easier for the buyer to buy because they now have to put together less actual or real money.
Got you. Now, what about if you own, let's say, many different types of equipment for your business, and you decide, is it common for them to say, well, I'll sell you the business, but then I'm going to lease you some of the equipment that I own? Does that happen, or most people like, no, we want to buy your business and we want everything that you own?
Well, most buyers want to buy and own everything, but it's extremely rare actually for businesses to sell on what's called cash terms. So in almost every situation, vendors are asked to finance part of the transaction anyway. So let's say, someone's going to buy your business for $100,000. They might give you half of that down and then pay you the balance over a couple of years. And so from the seller's point of view, if you said, well, if I'm going to take payments over time, then I want to register my loan with some kind of security. I want to put a lien on something. And so you might put a lien on that equipment, or you might simply say, I'm not going to include the equipment in the sale. I'm going to lease it to you. Now, that's a way for you to protect yourself if the buyer doesn't make those payments. What the buyer is likely planning on, though, Tim, is they're likely planning to use those assets as collateral for the bank. So most of the time, the buyer will use the assets of the business as collateral for the bank to get that down payment they give you and then ask you to finance part of the deal anyway. And the big reasons why vendors often have to finance part of the deal are, number one, it's almost impossible to put together the money to buy a business because if it's a good, successful business, there will be a lot of what's called goodwill, which is value over and above the value of the tangible assets. And goodwill is really difficult to get financing for because it can be so easily destroyed. And the other thing is that the buyer, they need to know that what you're disclosing to them is the truth. So when it comes to buying a house, for instance, you can get an inspector to look at a house and find all the problems. But when it comes to a business, there's too many moving parts. We have receivables, we have payables, we have employees. Some of them drink, some of them are stealing from you. And so there's all these different potential problems under the surface. The buyer ends up relying a lot on the information that a seller shares. And then what if it turns out that some of the information is false, misleading, or actually fraudulent? So those vendor financing notes are a way to hold sellers accountable. And what will often happen is in the terms of the note, it will say that the note is subject to offset in the case of a material misrepresentation, for example. So if it turns out I buy the business and the sales figures you gave me were made up and the sales don't really exist, then what I do as the buyer is I say, look, you misrepresented information to me. I'm not going to pay you on the note. And what it does is it transfers part of the risk in the purchase to the seller. So a seller, knowing that they're going to have to finance part of the deal, now understands that they have to be forthright and honest. And what I often teach people when they're going through my buyer seminars is that if a vendor won't agree to do any vendor financing, it means one of a couple different things. It could mean, number one, that they're ignorant as to how businesses are sold, which is completely possible, especially if they're dealing with an unqualified intermediary, someone who doesn't know what they're doing. Like some people try to sell their business with a real estate agent, for example. The other thing it could mean is that they know that they're lying. So they're not willing to finance part of the deal because they've made up information and they know they're going to get caught and they won't get the rest of their money. Or number three, it could mean that while they believe the information is true and they're being honest, they may not have any confidence in the buyer. They might not think that you're able to run the business, so they're not willing to lend you part of the money to buy it because they're afraid they won't collect. And all of those reasons are an excellent reason not to buy a business.
Well, that's great information. And, is there kind of a length of time that you would educate, the students who come through your course or get information from you who say, either they're buying or they're selling a business? Is there kind of a status quo of the amount of time to say pay back a loan, whether it should be, within the first 3 years or or get it all done within the first year or 2 years?
It depends on the type of business, quite honestly, and it depends on how much is being financed. So I've been a party to deals where, the loan was repaid over 10 years. I've seen a lot of 6 and 7 year deals. I've seen a bunch of 3-year deals. I've also seen deals where the vendor gets no payments for 5 years. So the buyer takes over the business, owes the money to the vendor, but there's no payments for 5 years because in some cases, bank lenders will have their own special rules. So there's one lender I'm thinking about in particular. They require a certain debt to equity ratio on the buyer's opening balance sheet. And if the vendor is willing to do a vendor financing and forego payments for 5 years, they will consider that note to be equity, not debt. And so oftentimes what will happen is if this lender is part of the deal, the buyer, in order to qualify for the loan, will say to the seller, look, the only way I can get this money to buy your business is if you'll agree to these terms. And what ends up happening then is the buyer or the seller walks away from the table with the bank's money and the buyer's down payment of their own money. But then they have to wait 5 years before they start collecting on the balance of what's owed. And that's because the bank is protecting its own interests. They want to make sure that the buyer is going to be able to take over the business, run it successfully, pay down their loan before they get the burden of having to pay the note to the seller. Now, on the positive side, that lender, if they see you're doing well, they will actually offer to buy out the vendor. So sometimes what happens if the takeover is successful and the buyer's doing well, that bank will come forward and say, we'd now like to buy out the vendor, and the vendor ends up getting their money sooner than 5 years, all at once.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it really depends on the circumstances. There's no hard and fast rules or a certain rule of thumb as to how these things are done. The other interesting thing about vendor financing when you're buying a business is the payments often can be more flexible in that they can be structured to the cash flow of the business. We often think of a bank loan being a set amount every month is the payment. And I've seen a lot of deals done with seasonal businesses where differing amounts of money are paid at different times of year.
Well, that's really interesting. And for sellers of companies, sometimes they may be reluctant to kind of spread it out too far because they may think, man, they're giving me a little bit of money up front to buy my business, and then they're going to pay me in installments over, X number of years. What if they run my business into the ground, they just stop paying, and then I'm left with a little bit of money and a business that's now just basically default and ruined?
Yeah. Well, and that's the first knee-jerk reaction that a lot of sellers have. And until I explain to them the benefits of financing a sale of a business. So, for example, if a seller got all the money on closing day, what would they do with the money, right? And a lot of people will tell you, well, I would invest the money. And so most vendor financing notes are done, with interest rates like 7, 8, 10%. It's very difficult to go out and find a rate of return like that. So number one, the vendor note itself can be a very good investment for the seller. Number two, if the buyer buys your business, and let's say they run it for 4 years, they have been paying the bank for 4 years, they've been paying your note for 4 years, so you've collected all the down payment money, you've collected your note payments for 4 years, and let's say they default, okay? Well, the bank knows that you're owed money, and the bank also knows that they don't know how to run the business. So what will often happen is a bank who knows that there's a vendor financing note in place will call the seller and say, look, if we liquidate this business, you're going to get nothing. Why don't you come in here and you foreclose on the business and you take over what's owed on the note at the bank? And so what ends up happening is the sellers, if the buyer fails, can often get 60, 70, 80% of the original amount they were supposed to get, and then they get the business back with no money down simply by agreeing to make the payments to the bank. And the seller has the skills and ability to bring the business back. They know how to run the business. And so I've actually known people who have sold businesses, the buyer has failed, they've ended up taking back the business, and after a couple of years of rehabilitation, they've sold it again for the same amount of money they sold it for originally and went through the cycle again. So selling a business and on vendor financing and having the buyer fail can actually be one of the most lucrative things that can ever happen to a seller.
Interesting. Never looked at it that way. Are there some businesses out there that you would encourage people to stay away from when it comes to buying?
No. I mean, every business has its own set of risks, and every industry has its own set of risks. Really, what I tell buyers they need to do is they need to focus on their strengths and their own knowledge. So if people, are a civil servant or they work at the bank or the power company or something, and they have this dream of owning, like a fast food restaurant, I always say the first thing you have to do is go get a part-time job in one and get your hands dirty and see how they're really operated. I've seen so many people buy businesses and industries that they didn't know, and without having knowledge of how these things operate, it's really difficult to look at it objectively and critically. What can often happen is people will get this romantic idea in their head of what it's going to be like to run that business. And when you buy a business, not only are you making an investment with your money, but you're usually buying yourself a job at the same time, because the buyer of a small business will likely become the owner manager. And so it's got to be a deal that makes sense financially, where people are going to be able to get a return on their money and have a cash flow to support their family. But at the same time, it's almost like you're looking for a job, because you're going to have to spend all your time there running the business. And so I've seen people make good deals on good businesses and then get in there and realize they hate being there. And that's not a position you want to end up in, because it's not like a job where you can simply quit and find something else. If you buy a business today, you might have to run it for 2 years before you can sell it.
Now, do you recommend that to your students or for people in general who are buying businesses to actually hire that owner to buy the business for them, but say, okay, I want you to work for me. I'll pay you a salary for X number of months or X number of years. Is that a good idea to help with the learning curve and to keep the business going so there's no real hiccups along the way?
In most transactions, there's what we call a transition period. And in most transition periods, if they're relatively short, are usually included in the deal. So you can buy a business from someone and ask them to stick around for a month, for example, to teach you how to run the business. And you can usually negotiate that as just part of the purchase price. When you start to talk about asking people to hang around for 4, 6, 12 months, then the sellers start to look at it within the frame of view of a job. And so then they usually want to get into some kind of compensation for doing that job. The type of transition period that I usually encourage people to negotiate is a 2-part one. So let's say, for example, a retail business or a restaurant, what I would advise people to do is get a transition period of a couple weeks. Think about it, Tim. Most new jobs that you've had in your life, within a couple weeks, you probably have a pretty good idea of what you're doing, right?
Sure.
Yeah. So you take over a restaurant, you get the seller to stick around for 2 weeks. But then you also write in there that within a year following the transaction, you can recall them for 5 full days. So you get them in there for 2 weeks, you learn how the restaurant runs, and then after a month or so, you've probably developed a little list of things you're not quite sure about. You call them up and you say, I want you to come in and spend a day with me. And then you go through those items that have crept up. And then maybe a few months later, now you have some kind of government returns you have to send in, or maybe you have to reapply for licensing. And you say, geez, I'd really like the help of that guy. You call him up again and you say, I want to recall you for day number 2. And he spends another day with you. And I find that that's the best kind of transition period because, the everyday stuff you can get down pretty quick. And the things that come up occasionally, you want to be able to go back and get that person's advice. Here's another neat feature of the vendor financing, though, is in my experience, whenever buyers owe money to sellers, the sellers are usually open to talking to them because the seller knows that you need to succeed as a buyer in order for them to collect their money. So even beyond normal transition periods, I've known buyers and sellers where the buyer, if he needs to, will call up the seller and talk to him on the phone, and the sellers are more than happy to talk with them. And in almost every case that I've worked on, every file I've worked on except 1 or 2, the buyer and seller end up forming a friendship. And that's one of the critical things when you're talking about one of these deals. Most people think about a deal to buy or sell something like a business much in the same way you buy or sell a house, where you may not even meet the other party, right? You deal with attorneys and agents and things like this, and you might not even meet the other person. But when it comes to buying or selling a business, you have to make sure that the interests of both parties become aligned. So when the buyer asks the seller for financing, it's because usually the buyer can't get the money anywhere else, and the seller needs to sell the business, and so they're willing to do that because they need to move on to some other thing, right? And then once the two of them are working together in the business, the buyer's taking control, the seller's providing support because the seller has an interest in the success of the buyer. If a buyer bought a business and paid cash and the seller walked away with all the money, there would be no more connection between the two. There would be no reason for the seller to have any interest in helping the buyer to answer their questions, to give a good transition or support period, right?
So it's almost like they had their money. See you, sucker.
Exactly,
I'm out of here.
right? And then if it turns out that there was a problem with the information presented, then the buyer has to go sue them and hire an attorney. That's expensive, right? So the vendor financing is more than just a way to mitigate risk. It's a way to ensure that the deal comes together and then the two parties can part ways in a way that works for both of them and have a successful deal.
Well, David, I love your tips. It really sounds like you know what you're doing. How did you become involved in buying and selling businesses and all of this fantastic kind of this industry?
Well, it's a neat story. I was once simply a finance broker. So all I did was I helped entrepreneurs obtain loans, leases, do what's called factoring facilities when you have to turn receivables into cash. And when I was doing that finance brokerage business, I kept running into people looking for money to buy businesses. And I wasn't an expert in the field at the time, but I could tell that a lot of these deals just weren't put together right. They didn't make sense. The expectations were wrong. And then when I started to learn more and more about what was happening, I realized that people that really didn't understand how to put deals together were trying to put deals together to earn commissions. And these would be, some people would call themselves business brokers, other people would be real estate agents, but there was a real lack of professionalism in my market. And so when the financial crisis of 07, 08, 09 came around, a lot of the companies that I was using as a source of capital, they went under in that crisis. And so I realized that I had to pivot my business because my pipeline had shriveled up. And I realized that there was a real need in the world of helping people buy and sell businesses. So I joined up with one of the major international franchise brands in the world of business brokerage because they gave me access to training. And over a 2-year period, I actually devoted 3 weeks. I had to travel. I spent a week in Ottawa, a week in Atlanta, and a week in Orlando. And I became the first person in my area to be certified in buying and selling businesses. And I eventually took over the office I was working with, the business brokerage office, and I ran it for 3 years. And in those 3 years, I sold 36 businesses for other people. But at the end, though, the model of the business broker just wasn't working. And so the business brokerage model is it's based upon the real estate model where business owners hire the broker, and when the business is sold, a commission is paid. And the problem with that is a problem from everyone's point of view. So from my point of view as the broker, I would take on these businesses, and I had some of them on my desk for 3 years before they sold. So my cash flow was erratic, and it was like a roller coaster. Up, down, up, down, up, down, with no regularity. The sellers didn't like it because the invoices I ended up giving them were huge. I had to give somebody an invoice one day for $96,000. Okay, they weren't happy about it. I had worked long and hard on their file, but they paid me this huge sum of money. And part of the reason why I had to charge people such incredible sums of money were all of the files I worked on that didn't sell, right? Because I ended up working for those people for free. So the sellers who were successful didn't like it, and the sellers who were unsuccessful got a free ride, which is hardly fair. And then the buyers, they would come in and talk with me, and they would, listen to what I had to say, but they had to take everything with a grain of salt because they knew that I made money when they bought a business. And so can you really trust my motivations? So I left that industry. I got out of business brokerage, and I reformatted what I did into a consulting model. So now the way I do it is I work with buyers and sellers, but I work much more in the same kind of fashion that an accountant or an attorney works. So you go to the attorney, you say, I need a will, and he makes the will for you, and he charges you for that. And you go to your accountant, you say, I need help with my tax return. He does it for you, and he charges you for that. So in a similar fashion, I've got a list of services that I do for buyers and for sellers. And each step of the way that people go with me on their journey, I charge them for what I do. And at the end of the day, there's no commission or fee that's due when the transaction occurs. So my sellers enjoy it because they end up paying me far less than if they had hired a business broker. And my buyers like it because I can actually give them honest to goodness advice, and they can pay me to look at a file, and I can come back to them and say, look, this isn't a good deal unless you can get these kinds of terms at this price. And if you can't get that, you should walk. And there are very few people in the business brokerage world that'll tell a buyer to walk because they need the transactions to happen in order to make their car payments and their mortgage.
Well, David, I love this new model that you set up. It sounds like it benefits everyone. It's a win-win-win, so to speak. And since you've created this new model and went off on your own doing this, has there been a time where you kind of questioned what you were doing, where it was mentally challenged? What happened and how did you get through it?
Well, actually, the new consulting model is the solution from the challenging period of my life. And the challenging time was actually the fall of 2011 when I still owned the business brokerage office. And what had happened was I had 6 different deals closing that year, and they were going to bring in $250,000 in commissions. And in very short order, 3 of the deals fell apart, and it had nothing to do with me, the buyer, or the seller. In one case, a bank that had issued a funding letter rescinded it, so they basically changed their mind. They didn't want to do the deal. In another case, it was a regulated industry where the buyer had to qualify for a license from a government agency, and they wouldn't give him one. So that deal fell apart. And then in the third case, it was a franchise business, and the buyer met with the franchisors and didn't like them and basically said, I'd love to buy this business, but I won't get into business with those guys. They were really rude and condescending to him, and he said, I don't want a relationship with them. And so 3 of my 6 deals fell apart. That $250,000 of revenue turned into $110,000. And when the money came in the door, Tim, I said, you know what? I'm done with this. There's too many people that can upset the apple cart and ruin these deals that I worked too hard to put together. There has to be a better way. And so I closed that office. I made a deal with an associate. They took over the accounts that were outstanding, and I left. I retreated, and that's when I started to think about how I could change things. I actually went and got a job so I could have an income, and what happened was the phone started to ring, and so I was driving in my car on my way to visit a client, in my role in the job I had. And this person said, yeah, I'm looking at selling my business. I heard you're the guy who can help me. And I politely explained that I was no longer a broker and that I wouldn't be able to help him. And then a week later, somebody called, and it was someone trying to buy a business. And they said, I've been to my attorney, I've been to my accountant. They've both told me what I need to get out of the deal, but neither of them seems able to tell me how to get there and what I should be looking at and how even I make sure that it's a good deal or any of these other things. And I said, you know what? I can help you, but I have a full-time job. I can only work with you on the evenings or the weekend. And I'm not a broker anymore, so I'm going to have to charge you like a consultant, because I have the information and knowledge you're looking for. And then I just waited, and then a few seconds later, the gentleman said, so you can meet me Saturday at 9? And I said, yeah, I can meet you Saturday at 9. And so it was basically me leaving the paradigm, leaving the system that didn't work anymore, and having a little break and being open to understanding. Because, when I was a broker, all kinds of people came into my office with businesses to sell, and they wanted to know what I did, and they wanted to know how I did it, and ultimately they didn't want to pay the kind of prices I was charging because they thought it was too much. And so those people were trying to tell me the model was broken. And I had buyers that would come in and they would look at businesses and they would end up not doing anything. And they would, bring other people in, friends, relatives, other professionals to look at the deals because they were trying to communicate with me that the model was broken. And it was only after I left the model was I able to clear my head and be open to understanding how to do things in a different way. And since I've changed over to this new kind of consulting model, it's very successful. I have new clients every week almost, and I work with them. They pay me for what I do, and I issue invoices every week, so my cash flow is smoothed out. And when people bring me crappy deals, I tell them right away, this is a crappy deal. If you do this deal, you're going to regret it probably for 10 years.
Don't bring David any crap, people.
What?
I said, don't bring David any crap.
Yeah, no. Well, if you bring it to me, I'll show you why it's crap. And
there you go. He'll be nice about it. Yeah.
What happens is people get excited. They get what's called buyer fever. They start to imagine themselves in this business and what they're going to be doing every day, and they're going to have all this money. And that buyer fever can blind them to certain things that certain things they should be paying attention to.
Yeah. Well, David, it sounds like the writing was on the wall for you to make a change. There was a significant amount of pain in that area. You turned, and then you went a different direction, and you were validated along the way and reinforced, your idea that, hey, I need to create this new model, and that is fantastic. And you just it is obvious you know what you're talking about when it comes to buying and selling businesses. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but before we go, David, tell people where they can find your books, where they can find you online, your website, all that great stuff.
Yeah, sure. Basically, my blog site is kind of the central nervous system of the whole thing. It's at davidcbarnett.com. And if someone is interested in buying a business and they want to learn more about buying a business, the site to go to is businessbuyeradvantage.com. And there's a course there, an online course called Business Buyer Advantage. It's over 9 hours. It's an adaptation of the full day program that I've been doing live for a few years now. And if people want to use discount code TIM, they can get a special price for being one of your listeners.
Excellent. That is fantastic. So discount code TIM, head over to busybuyeradvantage.com for this 9-hour course with a discount code of TIM. Well, David, thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure, and I'm sure I'll probably be contacting you in the future about buying and selling a business.
Thanks, Tim. It was great to be on the show.
Thank you.
Want more entrepreneurial tips? Go to timlaskas.com.